To the rest of the galaxy, Earth was a cosmic backwater, barely a blip on the radar. Inside the Great Hall of the Conquered, where 1,000 species decided the fate of star systems, humanity was basically a footnote. We'd joined this galactic club over 100 years ago, back in 2271, when our first faster-than-light ship nearly caused an interstellar pileup by stumbling into a Chavari trade route. Ever since, they gave us a seat at the table, a tiny one, way in the back, where the important folks never even glanced. The hall itself was an absolute marvel, a massive ring station floating in orbit around a dead star, with walls made of pure crystal that let the cold light of distant galaxies spill in from every direction. The representatives from over 600 species sat in tiered rows, rising up like the inside of a giant bowl. Down in the very center was the speaking platform, a raised circle of white stone where any ambassador could make their case. But whenever humanity's ambassador, Lena Vasquez, walked to that platform, most species just tuned her out. Lena was a tall woman, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, with eyes that saw everything. She'd been Earth's voice here for 11 years, and in that time, she'd learned two critical truths. First, the galaxy was packed with species who thought they were better than humans. Second, they were dead wrong. But today wasn't about proving them wrong. Today was about sheer survival. 3 days ago, the Valari Empire had delivered its ultimatum. The message had blasted across every single communication channel simultaneously, translated into 400 languages, but the content was chillingly identical in all of them. Submit or be destroyed. The Valari gave the Conquered 30 standard days to make a choice. After that, their war fleet would start moving, and it wouldn't stop until every species in the galaxy bent the knee. This wasn't just posturing. The Valari controlled over 9,000 star systems. Their warships were the biggest and baddest in the known galaxy. Their soldiers were literally bred for war. Tall, gray-skinned beings with 4 arms and eyes that could see in total darkness. For the last 500 years, they had steamrolled dozens of species, swallowing them into their empire like a great beast devouring smaller animals whole. Now, they wanted it all. The ultimatum sent a shockwave of panic through the Conquered. Emergency sessions were running 24/7. Species that had been rivals for centuries were suddenly scrambling to form desperate alliances. Military commanders from all over shared intel, and every report painted the same terrifying picture. The Valari's main fleet alone had over 3,000 capital ships, and each one of those monsters stretched 12 kilometers from tip to tail. Faced with that kind of overwhelming force, most species saw only 2 paths forward: fight and be annihilated, or kneel and live. One by one, they started to kneel. The Draenth Collective went first. They were a peaceful, aquatic species with no real military to speak of. Their ambassador literally wept as she announced their submission, her see-through body flashing with colors of deep sorrow. The Morvathi technocracy was next, then the Pelori Union, and then the Senth Dominion. Each announcement felt like a punch to the gut. In less than a week, over 100 species had officially surrendered to Velari rule. The ones who decided to fight back formed a shaky coalition, but it was fragile at best. The Kavari, a proud, insect-like race of warriors, committed their fleet. The Toron, giant beings made of living stone who were slow but hit like meteors, offered up their ground troops. A few others threw their lot in, but everyone knew the grim reality. Even if they combined all their ships, the coalition fleet was less than 1/10 the size of the Valari Navy. They weren't building a victory, they were just buying a little more time. And then there was humanity. Earth's military was widely considered a galactic joke. We had a small defense force of about 200 ships, and the biggest one wasn't even 3 kilometers long. Our technology was seen as mediocre, nothing special. We'd never even been in a major galactic war. When other species thought of humans, they thought of our weird food, our loud music, and our bizarre habit of keeping small animals in our homes just for company. Nobody expected a thing from us. Nobody even bothered to ask. That's why the entire hall fell into a state of stunned silence when Lena Vasquez strode to the speaking platform on the 15th day of the ultimatum. She paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the hundreds of faces, some so alien they defied description, others strangely familiar. She took a deep breath. The translation systems around the hall hummed to life, ready to broadcast her words in every language imaginable. "Earth declines," she said. The silence held for maybe 2 seconds. Then, the place erupted into chaos. Ambassadors were shouting over each other, their translators struggling to keep pace. Some were angry, some were baffled, but a lot of them were just laughing. Up in the higher tiers, where the Velari delegation sat cloaked in their black armor, a low, rumbling sound began, the Velari version of a good chuckle. The Velari legate, a decorated commander named Kairathon, rose from his seat. He was a giant, even for a Velari, standing nearly 3 meters tall with ritual scars covering all 4 of his muscular arms. His voice boomed across the hall, needing no amplification. "The insects refuse the boot," he drawled. "How delightful!" A wave of laughter rippled through the Velari delegation. Several other species joined in, not so much out of meanness, but because of the sheer absurdity of it all. Humanity, with its dinky little fleet and its bargain bin tech, had just told the most powerful military in galactic history to get lost. Vasquez didn't even blink. She didn't crack a smile. She just stood there on the platform, waiting patiently for the noise to subside. Once it quieted down, she spoke again. "Earth declines the ultimatum of the Velari Empire. We will not submit. We will not kneel. And we will not be explaining ourselves." With that, she stepped off the platform and walked calmly back to her seat. The hall was now buzzing with frantic whispers. The Shivari Admiral, a clicking insectoid named Teskith, swiveled 2 of his large compound eyes toward the human section. He felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't hope. Hope needed proof, and the humans hadn't offered any. It was something smaller. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was an ancient, primal instinct telling him that when a small creature refuses to run, you watch it very, very carefully. Back on Earth, the reaction to Lena's speech was divided. The general public had no idea how serious the Velari threat really was. The government had classified the most terrifying intelligence reports. Most people knew there was some political drama going on out in the galaxy, but the true scale of the danger was buried under layers of carefully worded press releases. This wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate policy. Deep beneath the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, in a room that didn't exist on any official blueprint, a group of 12 people sat around a conference table, watching a delayed feed of Lena's speech. They were the members of the Prometheus Council, an organization so secret that most world leaders didn't even know it was real. In one form or another, they had been meeting for over 80 years, ever since humanity first made contact with the galaxy. At the head of the table sat Admiral Reno Vassell. He was 67 years old, with a face that looked like it was carved from weathered oak and eyes that had witnessed things he could never speak of. He had dedicated his entire life to the United Defense Initiative, humanity's real military, which was hidden completely behind the small public fleet the galaxy thought was all we had. "She handled that perfectly," commented one of the council members, a Japanese woman named Dr. Hitomi Tanaka, who was in charge of the project's engineering division. Vassal just nodded. "She always does." "The Velari will make their move soon," said another member. "Their fleet positions suggest they'll hit the outer systems first. The Shivan corridor is the most likely target." "The Coalition's forces are already there," Vassal said flatly. "They'll hold out for a week, maybe 2 at most." Then Vassal's gaze fell to the center of the table. A holographic map of the galaxy glowed on its surface. Billions of stars were reduced to tiny colored dots, red for Villari space, blue for the conquered systems. And then there was another dot, way out on the fringes, far from any important star lane, out in the cold, dark emptiness beyond Neptune. It was a single green dot, pulsing softly like a steady heartbeat. "Then it's time we wake it up," he said. 6 hours later, a highly encrypted signal shot out from Earth. It zipped through a network of hidden relay stations, devices no bigger than a basketball, floating silently in the void between stars, completely invisible to any known sensor tech. The signal jumped from one relay to the next, crossing billions of kilometers in just a few minutes until it reached the far edge of our solar system. It traveled past Neptune, past the scattered disk of frozen debris that marked the end of the sun's reach, and pushed out into the true deep dark, where our sun was just another star in a sea of millions. Drifting there in the blackness was a rogue planetoid. It had no official designation. In the top-secret files of the Prometheus Council, it was simply known as Black Cradle. It was about the size of a small moon, its surface a dead crust of ancient ice and cosmic dust. To any passing ship, it would have looked like just another boring, lifeless rock, not worth a second glance. But deep beneath that frozen surface, the signal found its target. In a command center carved out of solid rock, a single screen flashed to life. The message was short, just 2 words, followed by an authorization code that had never, ever been used before. The Prometheus Protocol initiated. A silent beat passed, then light flooded the darkness. Not the soft flicker of a monitor, but colossal ribbons of light scaling walls taller than any skyscraper on Earth. They unveiled a cavern so immense it had its own weather, its own atmosphere, its own strange pull of gravity. And there, in the heart of it all, was the ship. The human mind simply couldn't grasp its size. It wasn't a vessel. It was a mobile landscape, a construct so vast it had its own horizon. From bow to stern, its hull spanned 214 kilometers. At its widest, it measured over 40 kilometers across. It dwarfed most asteroids and even some moons. For 80 years, the UES Prometheus was humanity's most profound secret. 3 generations of people had lived and died inside this hidden place, Black Cradle, to build this impossible machine. They had secretly mined the asteroid belt, pioneered technologies the rest of the galaxy couldn't dream of, and built a ship that shattered every known law of engineering. Many had spent their entire lives here, their graves dug into the very rock that housed their life's work. They did it all without a single word, not one leak, not one whisper. Every soul who worked on the Prometheus knew the secret was worth more than their own life. They didn't accept this because of orders. They accepted it because they believed. They believed that a day would come when the galaxy would turn on them, threatening to erase everything they'd ever built. And on that day, humanity would need an answer. That day was here. All across the ship, systems dormant for decades hummed to life, reactors ignited, their cores blazing with power sources no other species had ever dared to weaponize. Sensors bloomed open like the petals of giant mechanical flowers. In the cavernous hangars, fleets of fighters and drones sat in perfect, silent rows, awaiting the pilots and commands that were finally on their way. The docking clamps holding the Prometheus fast were each the size of a city block. One after another, they began to retract. The groan of metal on metal was a thunder that rolled through Black Cradle, shaking dust from walls that hadn't stirred for an age. On the bridge, a command center so large it required its own internal trams, the main view screen sparked to life. It showed the stars piercing through solid rock with impossible sensors. The galaxy glittered outside, a beautiful, cold, and hostile expanse. Admiral Vassal's voice cut through the silence, beamed from Earth across a chain of hidden relays. "Prometheus, this is Overwatch. Report status." Lieutenant Cade, a young officer born and raised inside Black Cradle, who had never once seen a real sky, placed a hand on his console. His voice trembled, but only slightly. Overwatch, this is Prometheus. All systems are green. The ship is awake. Back on Earth, Vassal squeezed his eyes shut for a second. 80 years, 3 generations, trillions of dollars and millions of lives, all poured into one single purpose. And now, tucked away in a hollowed-out rock at the edge of the solar system, it was finally opening its eyes. He looked at the council. "Send the crew," he ordered, "and get me Captain Ak." Far beyond, past the familiar glow of human stars, the Valari war machine was already on the move. Thousands of warships massed into unstoppable fleets, their commanders buzzing with confidence. They'd crushed species far more advanced than humanity. They'd shattered alliances that had stood for 1,000 years. They had never, ever lost a war. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the dark. And that, as humanity had understood from the very beginning, was the entire point. In the grand hall of the Galactic Concord, Liot Kion tossed back his third drink and laughed, replaying the human ambassador's final words. "Earth declines." What a punchline. He'd have to share that one with his soldiers before they turned humanity's pathetic little fleet into stardust. He gazed through the crystal walls of the cosmos, filled with the easy confidence of a predator that had never known a real threat. He never saw the Kavari admiral, Teskith, watching him from across the room. The starlight fractured into 1,000 tiny points in Teskith's compound eyes. A familiar, quiet feeling stirred in his old warrior's soul. He'd seen countless species face their end. He'd seen them scream and cry and beg for mercy. But he'd never seen one smile. Not like the human ambassador had. It was a tiny smile, almost not there at all. The kind of smile you wear when you know a secret that nobody else in the room does. Tessith had been in enough wars to recognize that look. It was the smile of someone holding a trump card you never knew was in the game. He clicked his mandibles softly. Whatever the humans had up their sleeve, it was either the bravest play he had ever witnessed or the most foolish. And a feeling he couldn't quite place told him it was probably both. Captain Saurin Ach had been preparing for this call his entire life. He was in his apartment in Logos when the summons came. Not on his comms, not through any official channel, but from a device hidden in a hollowed-out book on his shelf. The book was a copy of Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. It was a gift from his father, who got it from his grandmother, one of the original engineers on the Prometheus project 90 years ago. The device inside had been silent for all that time. 3 generations of the Achike family had guarded it, a sacred trust, always knowing what it meant and praying they'd never have to use it. When it chimed, a single, soft tone, Saurin put down his tea and just stared at it. After a long moment, he picked up the book, opened it, and read the simple message on the tiny screen inside. "Prometheus active. Report to Black Cradle. You have command." He closed the book. He took a slow look around his apartment, at the pictures on the wall, the plants soaking up the sun, the half-done puzzle on the kitchen table. He was looking at a life he was about to leave forever. Then he stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out the door without looking back. 12 hours later, he was on a shuttle that didn't exist, on a flight path that wasn't on any chart, headed for a place the galaxy had no idea was there. 47 other officers were with him, all drawn from the secret ranks of the United Defense Initiative. They were the command staff of the Prometheus, men and women who had spent years in hidden training facilities on Earth and Mars, running simulations for a ship none of them had ever laid eyes on. As their shuttle dove into Black Cradle through a hidden tunnel in the planetoid's south pole, Saurin pressed his face against the viewport. Ice walls streaked by. The tunnel was wide enough for a battlecruiser and descended for over 60 kilometers before opening into the main cavern. He'd studied the specs. He'd memorized every number. He'd seen holograms and technical drawings, but none of it prepared him for this. The Prometheus didn't just sit in the cavern, it dominated it, like a god sleeping in its own temple. Its hull was a deep, absorbing black, crafted from a material that seemed to drink the light, giving it an impossible density, like it was forged from a piece of the night sky itself. Faint lines of blue light pulsed along its length, like luminous veins. The bow swept forward in a design that was both graceful and predatory, like the head of some terrifying deep-sea creature. At the stern, massive engine assemblies jutted out, each one big enough to house a small city. Sauron realized he was holding his breath. "There she is," said Commander Yuki Tanaka, his executive officer, sitting next to him. She was the granddaughter of Dr. Hitomi Tanaka, one of the engineers on the Prometheus Council. Like Sauron, her career was a secret she had inherited. 214 kilometers of humanity's best-kept promise. "It's bigger than I imagined," Sauron managed to say. "That's what they all say," she replied with a small smile. The shuttle docked at one of the portside entry bays, a space so large you could park a whole squadron of conventional warships inside. Crews were already swarming the area, loading supplies onto transport carts to be whisked deep into the ship's core. The Prometheus was being brought to life for the very first time, an operation requiring the flawless coordination of tens of thousands of people. Soren stepped off the shuttle and onto the deck of his new ship. He stood still for a second, feeling the deep, steady hum of the reactors vibrating through the soles of his boots. He gave himself that one single moment of pure, unadulterated awe before the crushing weight of command settled onto his shoulders. The full crew complement would be 85,000 souls. They were already on their way, launching in waves from hidden bases on Earth, Mars, Europa, and Titan. Every one of them was a specialist who had trained for a mission they hoped would never happen. Fighter pilots and drone operators, engineers and medics, weapons techs and intelligence analysts, right down to the cooks, cleaners, and counselors. It takes a whole civilization to operate a ship of this magnitude, and that's precisely what the Prometheus was, a city with a singular, secret mission. For the next 48 hours, Sauron explored every inch of it. It was a time-honored tradition for a new captain to know their vessel inside and out, but on a ship like the Prometheus, it felt more like a sacred pilgrimage. He zipped through corridors that stretched for miles in small transport pods. He stood before the reactor complex, where 12 fusion cores pulsed with a steady blue glow, each one pumping out more power than the entire homeworlds of most species. He wandered the agricultural decks, where robotic farms cultivated endless fields under artificial suns, capable of feeding the crew for decades without ever needing to dock. Then he visited the hangar bays. There were 20 of them, lining the ship's sides like the chambers of a colossal, mechanical heart. Inside each one, sleek, black strike fighters were arranged in perfect, deadly rows. But nestled between them were the drones, thousands upon thousands of them. These were smaller, faster, and controlled by an AI that could think and react faster than any living pilot. All told, the Prometheus carried a swarm of 14,000 combat drones and 2,200 crewed fighters. It was, without a doubt, the most formidable military force a single species had ever created, and the rest of the galaxy had no clue it was coming. Soren's tour concluded on the bridge. It wasn't at the top of the ship, but buried deep within its core, shielded by hundreds of yards of armor plating. The bridge was a massive, circular chamber. Its domed ceiling was a screen, showing a perfect, real-time view of the outside. Right now, the icy walls of its hidden dock, the Black Cradle. Crew stations were set up in rising tiers of concentric circles, manned by officers who were finally touching the real controls they'd only ever used in simulators. In the very center sat the captain's chair. It wasn't a throne. There was no gold, no fancy designs. Just a solid, functional seat. with built-in controls and a direct neural link to the ship's mind. The moment Soren sat down, he felt the link connect, a faint tingle running up his spine as the ship's consciousness merged with his own. For one breathtaking second, he felt it all. The entire 214 kilometers of the vessel, every hallway, every room, every humming reactor and sleeping weapon. The Prometheus wasn't just big, it was alive, humming with the energy of its 85,000 souls. "Status report," he said, his voice calm. Commander Tanaka, at the station to his right, brought the data online. "All primary systems are green, Captain. Reactor output is at 92% and climbing. Weapons are on standby. And the cloak is ready." The cloak. That was the single most vital piece of technology on the entire ship. The very reason the Prometheus had been built in secret for 80 long years. Other species had stealth tech, sure, things that dampened sensors or absorbed signals, but they all had weaknesses. They could all be beaten. The Prometheus had something else entirely. The engineers called it gravitational refraction cloaking, but that name didn't do it justice. The system literally bent the fabric of gravity around the ship, creating a bubble of warped space-time. Light, radiation, sensor pings, everything just flowed around the vessel like water around a stone in a river. From the outside, the ship wasn't just hidden. It simply wasn't there. The space it occupied appeared completely, totally empty. No one else in the galaxy had this technology. Most didn't even think it was possible. Human scientists had figured out the theory nearly a century ago, and the Prometheus Council decided to keep it their ultimate secret, their ace in the hole. It was the one weapon that could never be countered, because nobody even knew it was on the table. "Navigation," Soren commanded. "Set a course for the Shivang corridor." The officer, a young lieutenant named Park, glanced up. "Sir, that's deep in hostile territory. The Valari forward fleet is already moving in." "I know," Soren replied coolly. "That's exactly why we're going." The intel had been pouring in. The Valari Empire had launched its big offensive right on schedule, hitting the Shivang corridor first, a critical choke point in space. In a desperate attempt to stop them, a coalition of 5 allied species had gathered their fleets to make a stand. Led by the famed Kavari Admiral Teskith, they had managed to scrape together about 300 warships. It was the biggest fleet the so-called conquered races had ever put together. A noble effort, really. But against the 400 state-of-the-art Valari warships bearing down on them, it was nothing more than a suicide mission. Admiral Vassel's orders had been crystal clear. Take the Prometheus to the corridor, shatter the Valari assault, and finally reveal to the galaxy what humanity was truly capable of. The element of surprise was their greatest weapon. You can't defend against something you don't even know exists. Leaving the Black Cradle was a slow, 6-hour process. Massive docking clamps retracted one by one, each release sending a deep shudder through the ship's frame. The engines didn't roar to life. They ignited with a subsonic hum that vibrated deep in your chest. Impossibly, agonizingly slow for something so gigantic, the Prometheus began to slide forward. It moved through the immense ice cavern and into the exit tunnel, with less than a kilometer of clearance on either side. A single mistake would have been catastrophic. Lieutenant Park guided them with nerves of steel and a pounding heart. The moment they cleared the tunnel and entered open space, a collective sigh of relief went through the bridge. The cold, ancient stars looked on, uncaring. "Activate the cloak," Soren ordered. The system engaged. On the main screen, nothing changed. To them, everything looked the same. But through the neural link, Soren felt it. A subtle shift, as if the universe itself had just agreed to look the other way. The Prometheus winked out of existence and began its silent journey. It was a 3-day trip at top speed to the Shivan corridor. 3 days of constant drills, combat simulations, and a thick, simmering tension. Pilots were in their cockpits running launch drills. Drone operators were syncing with their neural interfaces, each one ready to command dozens of unmanned fighters at once. Weapons officers ran diagnostics over and over again. And in the deepest part of the ship's core, behind vault doors that required 3 different security clearances, a special team was making the final checks on Longinus. Longinus was the ship's main gun, a spinal-mounted cannon that ran almost the entire length of the vessel. It didn't fire shells. It didn't fire lasers. Longinus worked by taking matter and compressing it into a microsingularity, a tiny artificial black hole. It would then fire this singularity down a magnetic rail over 100 kilometers long until it was moving at nearly the speed of light. The projectile it created couldn't be stopped by any shield known to exist. When it hit a target, it didn't explode. It consumed. Everything for several kilometers around the point of impact was simply pulled in, crushed into nothing. Fired into a fleet of enemy ships, it would rip through vessel after vessel before finally fading, leaving only stardust behind. Longinus had never been fired for real. The weapons team treated its systems with the kind of cautious awe you give to something truly terrifying. On the 3rd day, the Prometheus arrived. The corridor was a stunning channel through space, framed by 2 massive nebulas that glowed with purple and blue light. And caught in the middle of this cosmic painting was the Coalition fleet, holding a desperate defensive line. Sauron watched the tactical display, a knot tightening in his stomach. They were in rough shape. Their ships were a messy collection of whatever they could find. Hulking Shivari cruisers, chunky Turan dreadnoughts, and nimble frigates from other species. They were brave, no doubt. They were determined. And they were about to be completely annihilated. On the far side of the corridor, the Velari fleet was advancing, a perfect, disciplined wall of destruction. Imagine facing an enemy that has never, ever lost. That's the nightmare facing a small coalition fleet. They're staring down 400 Velari warships, each one a gray monster covered in guns. And in the middle of it all, the Velari command ship, a 12-kilometer behemoth, the personal headquarters of War Prince Ithal. This guy was a legend. 43 victories, 0 losses. He'd crushed 6 different species into dust, and he saw this new fight as just another Tuesday at the office. He figured 2 hours, tops. And the tragic part? The Coalition knew he was probably right. On the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Wing, Admiral Tessith watched the enemy approach with all 6 of his eyes, and knew he was leading his people to their end. What would you do in his shoes? His unique vision could track hundreds of enemy ships at once, and every single one was a death sentence for the brave souls under his command. Following the ancient tradition of his people, the Shivari, he had already written his death poem. It was short and simple, as it should be, speaking of duty, the light of distant stars, and the honor in making a final stand. He'd sent it home an hour ago. All around him, his officers were focused, professionals who had already made peace with their fate. The comms channels were a quiet hum of last goodbyes, soldiers telling their families they loved them, captains giving their crews one last word of encouragement. It was incredible. Species that were total strangers just a month ago were now calling each other brothers and sisters. Tessith thought it was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing he had ever witnessed. "Admiral," his sensor officer reported, "the Velari fleet will be in weapons range in 18 minutes. Tessith clicked his mandibles, a quiet sign of acknowledgement. "All ships, prepare to fight. Today, we will show the galaxy what true courage means, even when there's no hope of winning." But he was wrong. He had no idea that 20 kilometers above his flagship, a silent, invisible giant was watching the whole scene unfold, the largest warship ever conceived by any species in the galaxy. On the bridge of that ship, the Prometheus, Captain Saurin Ak leaned forward, a neural link feeding him a constant stream of information from every sensor. every ship, every weapon signature. He could feel the Coalition's quiet despair in their transmissions and the ice-cold arrogance in the Velaris. "All departments report combat readiness," Commander Tanaka announced crisply. "Fighter wings, all 2,200 pilots are in their cockpits, ready to launch. Drone swarms, 14,000 units are on standby. AI coordination is nominal." "Longinus?" Sauron asked, directing his question to the weapons station. After a tense pause, the reply came back. "Charged and ready, Captain." Sauron glanced at the tactical display. The Velari were getting closer. In just 15 minutes, they would unleash hell on the Coalition, and the slaughter would begin. 300 ships, filled with people who chose to fight on their feet rather than live on their knees, were about to be erased by an empire that saw them as nothing more than a nuisance. "Not on my watch," Sauron thought. "All hands," he said, his voice echoing through every corner of the massive vessel, reaching 85,000 crew members, spread across 214 kilometers of ship. "This is Captain Ak. In a few moments, we're going to do something no one thought was possible. We are going to remind the galaxy who we are. I know a lot of you are scared. Hell, I'm scared too. But we are here because our parents, and their parents before them, built this ship. We will not let their dream die today. Do your jobs. Trust in your training. And remember, the entire galaxy is about to learn a very important lesson. You should never, ever underestimate humanity." He took a final breath. Drop the cloak. The gravitational lensing system shut down. The bubble of warped space-time around the ship collapsed. And in a single, breathtaking instant, the Prometheus simply appeared. 214 kilometers of dark metal and glowing blue lights, bigger than a moon, hanging in the void like a judgment from a god nobody even knew existed. Every sensor in the corridor went absolutely wild. On the bridge of the Eternal Wing, Admiral Tessith's death poem vanished from his thoughts. All 6 of his eyes stretched wide. His jaw dropped open. His entire crew was frozen, staring at their screens, their entire understanding of the universe completely shattered in a single second. The sensor officer's voice was a choked whisper. "Admiral, it's 200 kilometers long." Tessith couldn't say a word. He just stared at the impossible ship that had materialized above his fleet. And deep in his warrior's heart, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Hope. Meanwhile, on the Velari command ship, War Prince Ithal saw the same sensor data and felt an emotion so alien to him, his species had nearly forgotten it existed. Fear. Ithal stared at his screen, refusing to process what he was seeing. He was a conqueror. He burned entire worlds for breakfast. He'd watched enemy commanders beg him for mercy. In 43 campaigns over 2 centuries, he had never faced anything he couldn't crush or comprehend. Until today. This thing that appeared in the corridor broke every known law of military engineering. No one built ships this big. It wasn't logical. It wasn't possible. The resources required would bankrupt entire star systems. The energy needed to move it would be more than a planet produces in a year. And yet, there it was. 214 kilometers of impossible, hanging in space like a dark sword ready to fall. "Confirm that reading," Ithal ordered, his voice perfectly steady. A war prince never shows fear, not even to his own crew. His sensor officer, a young buck with scars on only 2 of his forearms, ran the scan again. And again. The results were the same every time. "Confirmed, War Prince. It's a single vessel. Length, 214 kilometers. Its mass is... it's beyond what our sensors can even measure." He hesitated. "And its origin, sir, it's human." Human. The word just hung there in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Officers glanced at each other with looks they would later deny ever making. Humans? Those soft little creatures from that wet backwater planet? The ones who kept pets and cried during movies? The species that one of their own famous poets had called insects? Those humans had just parked the biggest warship in galactic history right in his path. "Open a channel to the entire fleet," Ithal commanded. He had to project absolute confidence. "All commanders, this is the War Prince. The humans have deployed a large, unconventional vessel. This changes nothing. Our mission is to destroy the coalition. Hold your formation and prepare to attack." He had to believe it. Size isn't everything. A big ship just makes a big target. His fleet had weapons that could crack planets. Surely they could handle one oversized tin can, no matter how scary it looked. But a tiny voice in the back of his mind, the one that had kept him alive for 43 campaigns, whispered something he refused to acknowledge. It whispered, "If they could build that, what else can they do?" He crushed the thought and gave the order to advance. Aboard the Prometheus, Captain Sauron watched the Velari fleet start to move. It was the calm before the storm. "They're not backing down," Commander Tanaka noted. "I didn't think they would," Sauron replied. "The Velari have never met a problem they couldn't blast their way through. Retreat isn't in their vocabulary." "Well then," Tanaka said with a grim smile, "I guess we'll have to teach them a new word." Sauron nodded and opened the ship-wide channel again. "All wings, launch." The Prometheus had 20 hangar bays, 10 running down each side. When they all opened at once, it looked like the ship itself was breathing out a storm. Fighters shot out in streams of black and silver, hitting combat speed almost instantly. Right behind them came the drones, smaller and faster, moving together in swarms that twisted and turned like giant schools of metallic fish. 2,200 pilots and 14,000 drones. Within minutes, they formed a massive combat cloud that filled the space between the Prometheus and the Velari fleet, a living, breathing wall of metal and fire. The Velari had top-of-the-line sensors. They counted every fighter. They counted every drone. They did the math, and the numbers were definitely not on their side. But the Velari Empire wasn't built on math. It was built on the belief that they were superior in every way, technologically, tactically, and psychologically. They had always been the predators. War Prince Ithal gave the attack order. The Velari fleet opened fire from maximum range. Blinding beams of white-hot plasma shot across the void, weapons that could slice through normal warships like a hot knife through butter. With 400 ships firing at once, they created a solid wall of pure destruction that should have annihilated any fleet in history. But then, the human drones moved, and it was like nothing the Velari had ever seen. The standard way to use drones was simple: throw them at the enemy in a big swarm, overwhelm their defenses, and sacrifice them to create openings for your bigger ships. It was simple, effective, and every species did it that way. The Velari came expecting an easy victory, a quick slaughter of an upstart species. But the human drone AI was something else entirely. Instantly, all 14,000 drones shifted, branching out into mind-bending fractal patterns. They weren't just dodging. They were thinking, predicting every shot from the 400 enemy ships before the cannons even fired. The first massive volley from the Velari, designed to wipe out thousands, hit nothing but empty space. On the Velari bridge, War Prince Ithal felt a chill run down his spine. That wasn't supposed to happen. No AI in the galaxy was that powerful. He was about to find out this was just the beginning of his problems, so stick around to see how the humans pull this off. "Recalculate! Fire everywhere!" Ithal roared. The Velari fleet switched from precise shots to just filling the void with plasma, a tactic that should have shredded the drone swarm. But the drones simply adapted again. The fractal shapes tightened, flowing through the gaps in the plasma field like water seeping through cracks in a dam. Sure, they lost a few, dozens, then hundreds, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to what the Velari expected. And here's the kicker. For every drone they lost, the central AI learned, updating every single surviving unit in less than a second. The swarm was learning faster than the Velari could think. "Now," Soren said calmly. "Fighters, go." The human pilots, who had been hiding behind the dancing wall of drones, shot forward. They weren't flying the biggest or toughest ships, but they were fast, and their pilots were trained to an insane, almost fanatical level. Every single one had spent thousands of hours in simulators, fighting this exact enemy. They knew how the Velari ships turned. They knew how their shields worked. And they knew a secret no one else had ever discovered. The Velari shields had a tiny flaw. Every shield has a refresh cycle, a split second of weakness. On Velari ships, that gap was 0.3 seconds. To a human pilot, flying at full combat speed with a targeting computer helping out, 0.3 seconds was an eternity. The first enemy ship to die was a massive cruiser on the fleet's left side. A squadron of 12 human fighters dove at it, their guns silent. They waited, until the very instant the cruiser's shields flickered. Then, 12 perfect shots hit the exact same spot on the hull in less than a third of a second. The blasts tore through the armor, hit the reactor core, and the cruiser vanished in a silent, brilliant flash of light. 7 seconds later, another one blew, then a third, then 2 more at the same time. On the Velari flagship, alarms screamed. Reports of critical damage were pouring in. Ships that had never been scratched were being taken apart by tiny fighters that knew their deepest secret. "They know our shield frequency," Eithal's weapons officer shouted, his voice cracking. "They're timing their attacks to the refresh cycle." "That's impossible," Ithal shot back. "No one has ever cracked our shield codes." "With all due respect, War Prince," the officer replied, "they clearly have." Eithal's 4 hands squeezed the arms of his command chair. The humans. They had been studying them. For years. Maybe decades. Watching, analyzing, learning every weakness, all while playing the part of a harmless little species from the galactic boonies. And then, the horrible realization hit him. They weren't hiding because they were weak. They were hiding because they were preparing. The battle was a chaotic masterpiece. The Velari were still incredibly dangerous. Their weapons could shred a human fighter in an instant. Sauron watched the casualty list grow, and every name felt like a personal failure. These were his people, but the tide had turned. The drone swarm was now deep inside the enemy formation, and the human fighters were using the chaos to their advantage, hitting the Velari warships from every direction at once. On the edge of the battle, the coalition fleet just watched, completely stunned. Admiral Teskith had his ships hold their fire, not out of fear, but because he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. The humans were fighting like a force of nature, relentless, adaptive, and utterly unpredictable. "Should we help them, Admiral?" his tactical officer asked. Tessith thought about it. His fleet was damaged, but they could still fight. "No," he said softly. "Not yet. Let's see what these humans can really do." What they could do became terrifyingly clear over the next 30 minutes. The Velari fleet was hurting, but Ithal wasn't done. He'd lost over 100 ships, but he still had nearly 300 left. The War Prince was smart. He pulled his ships into a tight ball, their shields overlapping to cover the weakness, creating death zones for the drones. It was a brilliant move. Against any other enemy, it would have worked. But he was using old strategies against something entirely new. "He's consolidating," Soren noted, watching the enemy formation. "That defensive sphere is tough. Attacking it head-on will cost us too many pilots." "He's learning," his second-in-command, Tanaka, added. "Give him another hour, and he might figure out how to stop the drones." "He doesn't have another hour," Sauron replied. He reached out through his neural link, and the Prometheus, the massive ship at the heart of the human fleet, began to move. For the entire battle, the 214-kilometer-long warship had just sat there. Now, it glided forward through the wreckage, a silent, terrifying giant. On the bridge of every Valari ship, a new kind of fear took hold. They had been so focused on the Hornets, they'd forgotten about the monster whose nest they'd kicked. Ithal watched the Prometheus get closer and made his choice. He was a war prince of the Valari. He would not run. "All ships," he broadcast, "form a spearhead. Target the human command ship. Full speed ahead." It was a brave command. It was also a fatal mistake. The remaining 260 Valari warships formed into a massive wedge and charged, their weapons glowing. The plan was simple. Throw everything they had at the Prometheus and pray that even a ship that big couldn't survive the combined firepower of an entire fleet. They were still 40,000 kilometers away when Sauron gave a simple, two-word order. "Longinus," he said. "Fire." Deep inside the Prometheus, its main weapon came to life. A tiny compressed black hole formed at the base of a 100-kilometer-long magnetic cannon and was fired at 97% of the speed of light. The Valari never even saw it coming. The invisible projectile, Longinus, slammed into the center of their formation. It didn't explode. It just erased everything it touched. It passed through the first ship, the second, the third, and the fourth, consuming them so completely that not even dust was left behind. It ripped a perfect, terrible line through the heart of the Valari formation, wiping out everything in its path. In less than 2 seconds, 83 ships just vanished. The blast's gravitational wake rippled outwards, yanking at the nearby vessels. Their reactors, already pushed to the limit from the battle, couldn't take the strain. One after another, dozens of ships suffered total system failures, containment breaches, and catastrophic explosions. The spearhead, once the pride of a galactic superpower, dissolved into a blossoming cloud of fire and twisted metal. Aboard the Valari command ship, which only survived because it was at the back of the fleet, Warp Prince Ithal stood on a bridge screaming with alarms and watched the tactical display show the murder of his entire strategy. More than half of his fleet was gone. The ships that remained were scattered, their formations shattered, their crews paralyzed with shock. Ithal was a warrior. He'd made peace with death before every battle of his life. But this wasn't a battle. This was an execution. The humans hadn't just defeated his fleet. They had made the entire Valari way of war, the very foundation of their empire's might, completely obsolete. "War Prince," his communications officer stammered, his voice trembling. "The surviving ships. They're asking for permission to retreat." Ithal stared at the display one last time. The Prometheus hung there in space, impossibly huge, its hull without a single scratch. It had just won the battle without taking a single hit. He closed all 4 of his eyes. When he opened them again, his crew saw something they had never seen before. Acceptance. "All ships," he commanded, his voice flat. "Full retreat. Head back to Imperial space." The survivors, less than 100 of them now, turned and fled. They bolted in every direction, their captains redlining their engines, desperate to get as far away as possible from the dark giant that had just unmade their world. The Prometheus didn't even bother to chase them. On its bridge, Captain Sauron leaned back in his chair and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A storm of data flooded Sauron's mind. Grim reports from his forces, casualty lists, and the status of every last squadron. They'd lost good pilots. They'd lost state-of-the-art drones. They'd lost friends. But they had not lost the fight. Commander Tanaka turned to him, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall on the bridge. "Captain," she managed, her voice thick with emotion, "the Valari are running for their lives. The Shivan corridor is ours." Sauron just nodded. He searched for that feeling of triumph, but all he found was the soul-crushing weight of their decision. They had just shown their hand. A secret kept safe for 3 generations was now on display for anyone in the galaxy with a scanner pointed their way. There was no putting that genie back in the bottle. "Get me a line to the Coalition fleet," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The channel opened to a universe of stunned silence, the sound of hundreds of crews, beings from a dozen worlds, trying to process the miracle they had just witnessed. Then, Admiral Teskith's voice crackled through the speaker, but it wasn't the voice of the weary, old warrior Sauron knew. It sounded decades younger, filled with a sense of wonder. "Human vessel," he said. "This is Admiral Teskith, aboard the warship Eternal Wing. I simply don't have the words to describe what you've done for us today." He paused, and the next words carried a profound weight. "My people, we compose death poems before battles we don't expect to come back from. I wrote mine this morning. Thanks to you, I get to tear it up." For the first time all day, Sauron felt a real smile spread across his face. It was a tired smile, but it was genuine. "Admiral Tessith, this is Captain Ach of the UE Prometheus. It's an honor to finally meet you. I'm glad we could ruin your poem." Across the corridor, on every single surviving Coalition ship, crews were erupting in cheers, crying with relief, and hugging each other. Entire species that had prepared to be wiped out were suddenly, miraculously, alive. The Valari hadn't just been stopped, they had been broken. A force the entire galaxy thought was unbeatable had been shattered by a single ship from a species everyone had written off as a backwater. Nobody. The battle data was already spreading like wildfire. Soon, every government and military in the galaxy would see the same impossible truth. A human ship, 214 kilometers long, had appeared out of thin air and annihilated the most powerful fleet in known space. After today, nothing would ever be the same. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Sauron gave himself one more second of peace. Then he sat up straight. "Set a course for the next major Valari fleet," he said. "This war is far from over." The Prometheus began to turn, a slow and massive titan, its blue-lit hull catching the starlight. It moved deeper into the galaxy like a promise and a warning, written in silent steel. Far behind them, in the wreckage-strewn corridor, Admiral Teskith sat alone on his bridge and slowly tore his death poem into tiny pieces. He wouldn't need it today. Maybe he never would again. The little insects from Earth, it turned out, had brought a boot of their own. Nobody in the galaxy slept that night. On 1,000 different worlds, people stared at their screens, watching the same data replay over and over. A ship, a human ship, 214 kilometers long. It had materialized from nowhere, destroyed 400 Valari warships, and was now pushing deeper into their territory with the calm confidence of a predator that knows it's at the top of the food chain. The galactic communication networks crashed within hours. Every diplomat, every general, every spy was asking the exact same question. How did the humans of all people, build something like that without a single soul noticing? The answer, which would take galactic historians years to fully grasp, was shockingly simple. Nobody was looking. Humanity had been so completely ignored, so thoroughly dismissed as a minor species, with nothing important to contribute, that no one had ever bothered to keep a close eye on them. The greatest intelligence failure in galactic history wasn't because of bad technology or a lack of spies. It was a failure of imagination. They simply couldn't imagine that the quiet little species from the wet, blue world had been building a godslayer in their backyard. But the Prometheus was just getting started, not even close. The Valari Empire spanned 9,000 star systems, a web of supply lines shipyards, and military bases built over centuries. It was a colossal machine of conquest. And like any machine, it had critical parts. If you broke enough of those parts, the whole thing would grind to a halt. Captain Saurin Achik knew this. Admiral Vassel, back on Earth, knew this. And the 85,000 crew members of the Prometheus, fresh off their first ever battle, knew the war had only just begun. And then, the Prometheus vanished. 1 second it was there, the largest object anyone in the Shivang corridor had ever seen. The next, it was simply gone. Its gravitational cloak engaged so smoothly that, as far as the rest of the universe was concerned, the ship just ceased to exist. The Coalition fleet, still in the middle of their celebration, fell into a stunned silence. The fleeing Valari survivors checked their sensors again and felt a fresh wave of pure terror. It was one thing to fight a monster you could see. It was something else entirely to know a 200-kilometer warship was out there somewhere, completely invisible, ready to appear at any moment. That fear became a weapon in itself. 2 days later, the Prometheus reappeared above the Valari shipyard at Korath Station, a gigantic orbital facility that cranked out 30 new warships every year. The shipyard's defense force, a garrison of 40 ships, detected the Prometheus the instant it decloaked less than 1,000 kilometers away. They had about 90 seconds to process their doom before the Prometheus launched a single wing of fighters. 200 fighters sliced through the garrison in under 10 minutes. The ships that put up a fight were obliterated. The ones that surrendered were disabled and left adrift. The shipyard itself received one message: evacuate all civilian personnel. Once the evacuation was confirmed, the Prometheus fired a single low-power shot that cut the entire station cleanly in half. The two pieces drifted apart, bleeding debris into space. And Korath Station, a 300-year-old symbol of the Empire, was no more. Then the Prometheus cloaked and disappeared again. 4 days later, it materialized in the Thesson system, home to the Valari's largest fuel depot. This network of refineries processed the exotic matter needed to power their entire war machine. This time, the depot was protected by 80 ships, a much stronger force that had been warned the human monster was coming for them. It didn't matter. The Prometheus decloaked right behind the biggest refinery, using its massive bulk to block the garrison's line of fire. As the Valari fleet scrambled to get into position, 14,000 drones poured from the Prometheus's hangars, swarming the enemy ships in a silent, deadly storm. But the drones weren't trying to destroy the warships. They toyed with them, scrambling their sensors and making them waste ammo on ghost targets that vanished at the last possible second. While the main fleet was distracted, elite human strike teams on small assault ships boarded the refineries and planted charges right on their reactor cores. When the bombs went off, the entire fuel depot ignited in a chain reaction that lit up the system brighter than its own sun. The garrison fleet, caught in the blast, lost 30 ships in that single explosion. The rest tucked their tails and ran. The whole operation, from reveal to getaway, took just 47 minutes. On day 6, the Prometheus targeted the communications relay at Venthi Prime, a critical hub that handled 60% of the Valari Empire's military signals. By taking it out, they effectively deafened the fleet commanders, stopping them from coordinating across sectors. Orders from the capital, which once took seconds, were now delayed by hours, and then by days. The vast, efficient war machine of the Valari military began to grind to a halt, like a giant beast that had its nervous system severed. On day 8, 2 more shipyards went up in flames. On day 9, a military academy that trained the Empire's top officers was forced to evacuate when the Prometheus appeared in low orbit and broadcast a single, simple message: "Leave, or we will remove you." They left. The Prometheus destroyed the training facilities, the ships, and the weapon caches, then vanished once more. Every strike followed the exact same playbook. the Prometheus would pop into existence without any warning, strike with unbelievable force, complete its mission, and disappear before the Valari could even dream of putting together a response. This wasn't chaos. This was surgery. Every single target was chosen to cripple a specific part of the Empire's ability to wage war: their production, their supply lines, their communications, their training. The Prometheus wasn't trying to annihilate the Valari Empire. It was trying to disarm it. Throughout the galaxy, the reaction was a mix of pure awe and absolute terror. On worlds that had surrendered to the Valari, species were quietly taking back their freedom. The Valari, it turned out, could be beaten. And all the species that had kneeled were now scrambling to their feet before anyone could remember they had been cowards. Alliances were redrawn in a single night. Trade deals were ripped up and rewritten. The entire political landscape of the galaxy was reshaping itself around a single, shocking new reality. Humanity was not who they appeared to be. On the floor of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Lena Vasquez suddenly found herself the most popular person around. Species that had ignored her for years were now sending diplomats to her office, practically begging for meetings. They wanted alliances. They wanted trade deals. They wanted protection. But most of all, they wanted to know how. "How?" asked the Dressenth ambassador, her see-through body swirling with the colors of pure confusion. "How did you build it? How did you keep it a secret?" Vasquez just smiled that same little smile that had so unnerved Admiral Tesketh just weeks before. "We built it because we had to," she said. "We kept it a secret because we could." She left it at that. The whole truth. The 80 long years of sacrifice, of engineers who died inside the Black Cradle without ever feeling the sun on their skin, of families who carried the secret like a sacred promise, of a species that looked at the galaxy and quietly decided it would never be a victim. That wasn't something you could explain in a meeting. It was something you had to live. Back on the Prometheus, the weight of the campaign was starting to show. The ship was built for long-term missions, but 14 days of non-stop fighting was pushing every system to its breaking point. Hull sections that were damaged back in the Shivang corridor were patched, but not properly repaired. They were losing fighters. They had started with 2,200, but were now down to 1,800, with hundreds more stuck in repair bays. The onboard factories were pumping out new drones, but they couldn't build them as fast as they were losing them, and the crew was exhausted. 85,000 people, many of whom had never seen a real battle before, were running on fumes and pure stress. The medical bays were packed, not just with physical wounds, but with the mental toll of war. Counselors worked around the clock, talking to pilots who had just taken a life for the first time, to drone operators who watched their units get wiped out by the hundreds, and to engineers who knew that every patch they applied was just barely holding the ship together. Soren felt all of it. It flowed through the neural link. The ship's pain was his pain. Its fatigue was his fatigue. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. The hardest fight was still to come. On day 12, intelligence reports confirmed exactly what Soren had been expecting. Emperor Kaiser the Undying had called out the throne fleet. Kaiser was ancient, even for a Valari. He had ruled for over 400 years, kept alive by the most advanced medical tech in the galaxy. His body was more machine than flesh at this point, a towering figure of gray skin and polished metal, sitting on a throne that was also his life support system. He hadn't left his imperial palace on Valaris Prime in over a century. He ruled through his princes and generals, a massive bureaucracy of conquest. But the Prometheus had called his bluff. His shipyards were in ruins. His communication network was a mess. His fleets were scattered and demoralized. And species that had been loyal for centuries were starting to whisper about rebellion. His empire was falling apart, and the only way to hold it together was to destroy the thing that was tearing it down. The Throne Fleet was Kaiser's personal army. 3,000 of the most powerful warships in the Velari Navy, kept in reserve at the capital just for this type of emergency. Every ship was manned by the Empire's best warriors, armed with the latest weapons, and led by officers hand-picked by the Emperor himself. 3,000 ships against one. The Velari were sure it would be a slaughter. On day 14, the Prometheus arrived at Velaris Prime. The planet was gigantic, nearly twice the size of Earth, with a thick atmosphere that stained its sky a permanent shade of red. Its surface was a monument to empire, towering cities, massive military bases, all built to celebrate 400 years of domination. From orbit, it looked like a world designed to make you feel small. The Throne Fleet was waiting, arranged in a perfect defensive sphere around the planet. 3,000 ships forming a wall of steel and energy that should have been impossible to break through. At the very center of it all, the Emperor's personal flagship, a 20-kilometer-long dreadnought called the Eternal Dominion, hung in high orbit like a crown. Then the Prometheus appeared. It dropped out of its cloak in low orbit, positioning itself between the Throne Fleet and the planet's surface. Its shadow fell across an entire continent, a wave of darkness that swept over cities and military bases, over billions of Velari citizens who looked up to see their sky turn black. On the ground, everyone froze. Some ran, some cried. But most just stood there, staring, unable to process the sheer scale of the thing that was blotting out their sun. Suddenly, every communication channel on the planet came to life. Every screen, every speaker, every neural implant lit up with the same voice. It was calm, steady, and human. "This is Captain Saurin Ak of the UES Prometheus. I am speaking to Emperor Kaiser and the people of the Velari Empire. Your fleet has attacked innocent species. Your empire is a threat to the freedom of this galaxy. We are here to end that threat. Your empire ends today. You get to choose how." In his palace, Emperor Kaiser the Undying heard that message and felt something he hadn't felt in 400 years. Rage. A pure, ancient, burning rage. A human, a member of a species his generals had called insects, was talking to him like an equal, was giving him an ultimatum, was casting a shadow on his world. "Destroy it!" he commanded, his voice a metallic hiss from the machines that kept him alive. "Destroy it now! All ships, attack!" The Throne Fleet surged forward. 3,000 warships descended on the Prometheus from every possible direction. The sheer scale of the attack was mind-boggling. It was more firepower than had ever been used in a single battle in the history of the galaxy. And it was all aimed at one ship. The space around the Prometheus exploded with light. Thousands of energy beams and missiles converged on its dark hull. For the very first time, the Prometheus took real, serious damage. The ship's shields, powered by the same gravity tech as its cloak, held up against the first wave. But even the Prometheus couldn't just ignore 3,000 ships firing all at once. Shield generators started to redline. Parts of the hull that were already weak from past fights began to tear. On the ship's port side, a concentrated blast broke through the shields and ripped through the outer hull, instantly decompressing 2 whole hangar bays and killing everyone inside. Saurin felt it through the neural link, a searing spike of pain and loss that made him grip the arms of his command chair. 312 crew members, gone in a flash. "Damage report," he said, his voice perfectly level even as his heart was breaking. "Port hangars 7 and 8 are gone," Tanaka reported. "We have hull breaches on decks 40 through 60. Reactor 3 is offline. Shield generators 14 through 20 are overheating." "Fighter wings," Saurin ordered. "Launch everything we have left. Drones, Full deployment. With a final, defiant roar, the Prometheus threw open its remaining hangar doors, unleashing every last fighter and drone into the raging cosmic storm. The space around the colossal ship instantly erupted into a chaotic ballet of war. Human fighters darted and weaved between the massive Velari warships, while swarms of drones moved in mesmerizing, deadly patterns. Fire crisscrossed the blackness in every direction. The human pilots fought with a desperate fury that even took them by surprise. They were bone-tired, terrified, and hopelessly outgunned. But they fought knowing that every species in the galaxy was watching them. Their sensor arrays all pointed at this one spot in space. The future of civilization was being decided right here, right now, and they were the ones at the heart of it all. Velari ships started to die. But it wasn't happening fast enough. The throne fleet was a monster, 3,000 ships strong, and even with the shield exploit, it could swallow losses and keep coming. Still, the human fighters and drones were sowing pure chaos, shattering the Velari's perfect formations. They broke their coordination, forcing each enemy ship to fight for its own skin instead of as a unified force. For 2 brutal hours, the battle raged. The Prometheus took a heavy beating, entire chunks of its hull vaporized by focused fire. The casualty count soared past 1,000, then 2,000. Their fighter losses were staggering, and their drone supply was dwindling faster than they could be replaced. But the Velari were losing more. Much, much more. The combination of this drone's fractal tactics, the clever shield cycling trick, and the sheer, unending pressure of the human attack was grinding the throne fleet down, one ship at a time. By the time the second hour was up, over 1,000 Velari vessels were either destroyed or crippled. It turned out Ithal had been right about one thing before he died. The humans had been studying the Velari for decades. They knew every single weakness, every vulnerability, every crack in Velari military thinking and technology. The Prometheus wasn't just a ship. It was a purpose-built anti-Velari weapon, and it was performing its job flawlessly. But in the end, it wasn't losses that broke the throne fleet. It was fear. It began at the edges of the formation, where ships started to quietly peel away. Captains who had served the Emperor with blind loyalty for decades suddenly looked at the absolute slaughter around them and decided that loyalty had its limits. The retreat started as a trickle, then it turned into a flood as more and more ships broke rank. Emperor Kaiser's voice screamed at them over every channel, a desperate mix of promised glory and threats of execution. A few ships hesitated and turned back, but most just kept running. Sauron saw the enemy formation crumbling and knew this was the moment. "Longinus," he said, his voice calm. "Target the densest group that's left. Fire." For the second time in the battle, the ship's spinal weapon lit up, unleashing a compressed singularity that tore through a cluster of 200 ships desperately trying to hold their ground near the Emperor's flagship. The path of destruction was total. Ships simply blinked out of existence as the singularity shot past them, leaving a perfect, empty corridor where the pride of an empire had been just moments before. "Again," Sauron said. "Fire." Longinus fired a third time. This shot was aimed wide of the Emperor's personal flagship on purpose. It was close enough that the gravitational wave slammed into the massive vessel, knocking out its port-side shields and sending the crew sprawling, but not close enough to destroy it. It was a message, loud and clear. Surrender, or the next one hits you. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Emperor Kaiser the Undying sat on his throne and watched everything he had ever built turn to dust. The throne fleet, his own personal hammer that had guaranteed his power for centuries, was shattered. Fewer than 800 ships were still able to fight, and most of them were running for their lives, ignoring his commands. The human ship just hung there in low orbit, battered but not broken. Its dark hull was scarred from the battle, but it was still whole, still deadly. He could still fight. He could order his own ship to charge the Prometheus, to ram it if he had to, and die in one last act of defiance that would be remembered for all time. But Kaiser hadn't managed to live for 400 years by picking glorious deaths over practical survival. He was old and he was cruel, but he wasn't an idiot. The Empire was over. The only question left was whether it would end with his death or with him still breathing. "Open a channel to the human ship," he ordered. The channel crackled to life. Soren's voice came through, as calm and steady as if he hadn't just fought the most impossible battle in human history. Emperor Kaiser's own voice was a wreck, full of rage and exhaustion. "You have made your point. I need to hear the words, Emperor." There was a long silence, maybe the longest silence in the history of the galaxy. "The Velari Empire surrenders unconditionally." On the bridge of the Prometheus, nobody cheered. The price of this victory had been far too high for cheers. Soren just closed his eyes and thought about the 3,700 crew members who had died in this fight. They were people with families, with dreams, with entire lives that were cut short to serve something bigger than themselves. He thought about the engineers buried under the rock of Black Cradle, the pilots who died at the Shivan corridor, and the 3 generations of humanity who carried the secret of the Prometheus like a stone in their souls, never sure if it would even matter. It mattered. "All ships, cease fire," he said softly. "The war is over." Within hours, the news hit the entire galaxy. The Velari Empire, the power that had dominated space for 500 years, had been toppled in just 14 days. Not by a grand alliance or a coalition of superpowers, but by a single ship from a species that most of the galaxy had never even taken seriously. The reactions were as different as the species themselves. The Shavari sang songs of war to honor the humans. The Dasan shifted their colors in vibrant patterns of joy and relief. The Tauron, who show emotion by vibrating, created a harmonic wave so powerful it was picked up by seismographs on planets 3 systems away. But under all that celebration, there was something else, something quieter and much more complicated. It was fear. If the humans could build the Prometheus in total secret, what else had they built? If they could hide a 200-kilometer warship for 80 years, what other secrets were they hiding? For centuries, the Velari had been the galaxy's boogeyman, and now they were gone. But the thing that had gotten rid of them was still out there, wrapped in mystery, and controlled by a species that nobody truly understood. In the great halls of the Galactic Conclave, Ambassador Vasquez was approached by the Morvathi ambassador, a crystalline being who had been one of the very first to surrender to the Velari. "Ambassador Vasquez," the Morvathi said, its voice like the tinkling of wind chimes. "On behalf of the Morvathi technocracy, I would like to propose a formal alliance between our peoples. We can offer you technology, resources, and—" "Thank you," Vasquez cut in smoothly. "I will forward your proposal to Earth. We would also like to discuss the terms under which humanity might share the technology behind your ship's cloaking system and perhaps that weapon." "No." The word wasn't angry or mean. It was just a simple, flat refusal that slammed the door on the conversation as completely as a vault door. The Morvathi ambassador just stared at her. All around them, a dozen other ambassadors who had been about to make similar offers suddenly felt the room get very cold. Vasquez stood and looked out at the entire assembly, at the hundreds of species who had ignored humanity for a century, who had laughed when she rejected the Velari's ultimatum, and who had watched from their safe seats while humans fought and died to save a galaxy that had never given them an ounce of respect. "Humanity did not build the Prometheus for power," she said, though nobody had asked. "We built it because we were afraid. We were afraid that one day something would come for us, and no one in this galaxy would lift a finger to help. We were right to be afraid. She let that sink in. Then she said something that would be debated and analyzed on every world for generations to come. The question all of you should be asking isn't, what did we build? The real question is, what will you build, now that you know what's possible when a species refuses to be helpless? With that, she walked out of the assembly hall. Behind her, the silence was deafening. 3 months after the Valari Empire fell, the galaxy was still trying to wrap its head around what happened. Diplomats argued, intelligence agencies dug for information, and military leaders threw out their old playbooks and started from scratch. Scholars and philosophers across 1,000 worlds wrote papers and gave lectures, arguing late into their nights about what it all meant. Quiet, unremarkable humanity had single-handedly taken apart the most powerful military force in galactic history. Every single assumption that every species had ever made about the balance of power was now completely wrong. And right at the center of this massive shift, the species that caused it all was being very, very quiet. And that made everyone very, very nervous. In the weeks after the surrender at Valaris Prime, the galaxy expected humanity to do what powerful species always do: claim new territory, demand tribute, and establish their dominance. The Valari had done it. The Morvathi had done it. Every species that ever got a military edge had used it to remake the galaxy for their own benefit. But humanity did none of those things. Earth's diplomats took part in the post-war talks at the Galactic Conclave, but their demands were so modest, they were almost confusing. When we won the war, we didn't demand a single planet, not a single moon. We didn't ask for a penny in tribute. So when the time came to decide what to do with the worlds we'd just freed, our representative did something unheard of. He voted to let them decide their own future. For the rest of the galaxy, this was either the kindest act in history or the most terrifying. They're up to something, the Morvathi ambassador warned anyone who'd listen. Nobody just gives away that kind of power. We need to find out what they really want. And when we do, we'll be sorry we didn't act first. But the Dren ambassador, who saw things a little differently, just said, maybe they just don't want the things you think they're supposed to want. And that, the Morvathi shot back, is what makes them so dangerous. The real story was both simpler and far stranger than any of them could guess. Back on Earth, in a hidden room, the Prometheus Council was meeting one last time. The same 12 people sat around the same table, where, just 3 months ago, they'd watched their ambassador refuse the enemy's ultimatum. The feeling in the room wasn't celebratory. It was heavy, exhausted, and tinged with a deep sadness none of them could quite name. At the head of the table sat Admiral Reno Vassal. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in those 3 months. Running a galactic war from a bunker beneath Geneva had worn him down in a way that a lifetime of service never could. His gaze was heavy, and his hands, always so steady, now had a slight tremor when he thought no one was looking. "The ship is ready," he announced, his voice raspy. "Captain Ach confirms she's fully operational. The crew—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The crew did more than we ever could have dreamed." 3,042 casualties, Dr. Hitomi Tanaka added softly. She knew the number by heart. She knew all the numbers, every dollar spent, every engineering challenge, and every single life lost building and flying the Prometheus. Those numbers were her weight to carry, and she carried them all. "And because of them, the galaxy is free," another council member offered. "Yeah," Vassal agreed, his eyes sweeping the room. "The only question is, what do we do now?" This was the very reason the Prometheus Council was created. Not to figure out how to build the ship, that was a job for scientists. Not to figure out how to fight the war, that was for the soldiers. The Council's one and only job, for the last 80 years, had been to decide what humanity would do the day after it won. They had argued about it for decades, running simulations, talking to historians, and studying the history of every empire that had ever risen and fallen. They looked at what absolute power does to people, how it twists you, how it turns saviors into tyrants, and heroes into monsters. And after all that, they came to a decision that most of the galaxy would call completely insane. "We stick to the plan," Vassal said quietly. "We're pulling back." Nobody argued. This was decided a long time ago. The council members just looked at each other, a quiet acceptance in their eyes, like people who knew this day was always coming. Ambassador Vasquez spoke last. She'd flown all the way from the Concord's capital just for this meeting and was heading right back. "I'll make the announcement tomorrow," she said, her voice firm. "It's not going to be popular." "It doesn't have to be popular," Vassal replied. "It just has to be right." The next day, Lena Vasquez strode to the podium in the Great Hall for the very last time. The place was packed, standing room only. Species that usually skipped these meetings had sent their top diplomats. The air was thick with the buzz of 1,000 different translation devices working overtime. Everyone knew the human was speaking today. Nobody had a clue what she was going to say. The rumors were flying. A new alliance, a demand for territory, an offer to share their superweapon, a power play for a permanent seat on the ruling council. Some came ready to make a deal. Others came ready to fight. A few even came ready to make threats. None of them were ready for what she actually said. Vasquez stood there, looking out at the massive assembly. She wore her usual simple dark suit, her hair pulled back tight. Her face was a perfect poker face, no hint of victory, pride, or anger. She just looked like someone with a job to do. "Distinguished representatives," she began, "I am here today to inform you that, effective immediately, the government of United Earth will be withdrawing from all active participation in galactic politics." A silence so deep fell over the hall, you could suddenly hear the faint hum of the station's air recyclers. "Earth will keep open basic diplomatic channels for trade and communication," she continued into the quiet. "We will honor our current humanitarian aid promises, but we will not be entering into any military alliances, we will not be making any territorial claims, and we will not accept any positions of galactic leadership. We will not be sharing the technology of the UES Prometheus, and we will not be involved in rebuilding the Velari Empire or deciding who gets their old territory." That's when the silence broke. The hall exploded. Shouts, questions, pleas, angry protests. A chaotic storm of 1,000 voices that pushed the translation systems to their limits. Ambassadors were on their feet, some furious, some bewildered, a few looking genuinely scared. Vasquez just waited. After 11 years at this podium, she knew the noise always faded eventually. When it did, she spoke again. "Many of you are asking why. I'll do my best to explain, but I know some of you won't get it." She let her eyes travel slowly across the room, trying to lock eyes with as many of them as she could. 3 months ago, this very assembly laughed when I said Earth would not bow to the Velari. You laughed because you thought we were weak. And you thought we were weak because you never really bothered to look at us. In 100 years as members here, not a single one of your species tried to understand who we are or what we could do. You wrote us off as a harmless little backwater planet. And a lot of you still see us that way." She paused again. The hall was dead silent now, hanging on her every word. "We built the Prometheus because we understood a fundamental truth. In this galaxy, if you can't defend yourself, sooner or later, someone stronger will come along and destroy you. The Velari proved that for 500 years. We didn't build our ship to conquer. We built it to survive." She stood up a little straighter. "But survival isn't the whole story. We've studied our own past. We know what happens when one group gets the kind of power we have now. We know that empires always start with the best intentions, to protect, to bring order. And we know how they always end, with cruelty, with arrogance, and with the delusion that power gives you the right to control others. She slowly shook her head. We refuse to walk down that road. We showed you that the mighty Valari could be defeated. We didn't do it to take their place. The galaxy doesn't need a new boss. It needs people who can stand on their own 2 feet, defend their own homes, and work together as true equals. That's not something we can give you. It's something you have to build for yourselves. She took 1 step back from the podium. The Prometheus is being decommissioned. All of its blueprints and technology will be locked away. If the galaxy ever faces a threat that no one else can stop, Earth will be there. But we will not be your guardians. We will not be your rulers. And we will not be your weapon. She then looked up to the Velari section, where the last of the Empire's diplomats sat in stunned disbelief. We will be what we've always been, a quiet species on a small blue world, just trying to live our lives and hope for a better tomorrow. With that, she stepped away from the podium and walked towards the main exit. The hall was still silent. Not a comfortable silence, but the heavy, stunned silence of a room full of people whose entire understanding of the universe had just been turned upside down. As she passed the Shavari delegation, Admiral Teskith lumbered to his feet. He wasn't a politician. He was a military observer. But he stood, and he brought his 4 massive armored forelimbs together in the highest salute of his people, a sign of respect saved for a warrior who showed not just incredible bravery, but also the wisdom to know when the fighting was over. Vasquez stopped. She looked at the old, insect-like soldier, and for a fleeting second, her perfect diplomatic mask cracked. Her eyes shone. She gave him a simple nod, a small human gesture that said more than words ever could. And then she walked out of the hall, never to return. 48 hours later, the Prometheus left its repair dock and vanished into the deep dark. Captain Sauron. Ak stood on the bridge, the starfield on the main screen a silent witness as his ship eased out of the hollowed-out planetoid and into the black. The silence on the bridge was heavy. Every member of the crew knew the score. The orders had come down from Admiral Vassal himself. The Prometheus was about to become a ghost. A new home, a location that would never be logged, charted, or whispered about. The ship would stay active, the crew would rotate in secret, but to the rest of the galaxy, they were about to vanish. Before they went dark, Sauron keyed the ship-wide comms. "This is the captain," he began. "Before we disappear, I need you all to hear something. For the last 3 months, you've done what the entire galaxy said was impossible. You went up against the biggest military machine in known space, and you won. You saved billions of souls on hundreds of worlds. You have the thanks of species who will never even know your names." He let that sink in, his voice dropping a little. "Now, we have to do something even harder. We have to fade away. We have to take this ship and everything it stands for and hide it so the galaxy can finally learn to protect itself. I know some of you feel this is unfair, that after everything we've given, we deserve to be recognized, to have a seat at the table, to hold some power. I get it, I really do." He looked around the bridge, meeting the eyes of his command crew. Tanaka, Park, Cade, the faces of the family forged in the hardest weeks of his life. But humanity doesn't need that kind of power. We've already shown them what we can do. The galaxy knows. From this day until the end of time, every species that looks up at the stars will know that somewhere out there, in the dark between the suns, there is a ship. They won't know where we are. They'll never know when we might show up. And that doubt, that quiet little what if, is a better shield than any fleet we could ever build. A smile touched his lips. We're about to become the greatest ghost story this galaxy has ever told. The tension broke. His crew smiled back, a few of them even laughed. A few wiped at their eyes. Then, one by one, they turned back to their consoles. Their duty. "Engage the cloak," Sauron said, his voice firm again. The gravitational lensing system spun up. The Prometheus, 214 kilometers of humanity's finest, simply folded itself out of sight. In minutes, the solar system was a memory. In hours, it was in the true deep, the vast, silent ocean between stars where nothing lived, nothing watched, and a ship could hide forever. Every intelligence agency in the galaxy scrambled, pointing their best sensors at the ship's last known coordinates. They searched with everything they had. They found absolutely nothing. It was as if the Prometheus had never been built. Back at its secret birthplace, Black Cradle, the teardown was already underway. The construction yard, humanity's best-kept secret for 80 years, was dismantled with the same cold precision that had created it. Every tool was packed up, every file scrubbed. Every inch of every tunnel was sterilized of any human trace. Then the tunnels were collapsed, the massive caverns filled with rock. In just a few weeks, Black Cradle was nothing more than a dead rock in the cold outer dark, as boring and empty as it had been for billions of years. On Earth, the United Defense Initiative was officially disbanded. Its personnel melted back into civilian life, taking their incredible secrets with them. They became teachers, farmers, mechanics. Some just sat in their backyards, watching the sky, remembering the impossible thing they had helped create. The world kept spinning. People went to work, raised families, and argued about sports and politics. The Prometheus was never officially confirmed. It became a global urban legend, the secret everyone knew but nobody could prove. And eventually, the legend faded into the background noise of everyday life. Across the galaxy, the ripples of humanity's sudden exit spread for years. Without a top dog to keep everyone in line, old enemies had to learn to talk. New alliances were born not from fear, but from simple need. The Chavari and the Toron signed a defense pact. The Drasen and Pelori started a joint science project. Even the eternally suspicious Morvathi finally joined a 20-species security council. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't perfect, but it was exactly what Ambassador Vasquez had dreamed of. Conquered investigators scoured every battlefield, hoping to find a single screw, a flake of paint, anything that would give away the ship's secrets. They found nothing. The humans had cleaned up after themselves perfectly. The only proof the Prometheus ever existed were the battle recordings from the Shivan Corridor and Valaris Prime, data that showed what the ship could do, but gave zero clues as to how. So the Prometheus passed into myth. Parents told their children stories of the human ghost ship. Species who had never even seen a human spoke of them with a mix of awe and a healthy dose of fear. The ship in the dark became a common saying, a phrase for any hidden protector or unseen threat. And back on Earth, life just went on. Humans did what they always did. They lived and loved and argued and made up. They kept pets, played loud music, and ate weird food. Sometimes they'd look up at the night sky and wonder about the galaxy they'd saved. But mostly they focused on the small things that truly mattered. Family, friends, and the simple joy of being alive. Meanwhile, in a conquered detention cell orbiting a neutral star, the former Valari legate, Kion, sat alone. The cell wasn't bad. It had a bed, a table, and a datapad loaded with approved content, news, textbooks, and the complete, unedited battle recordings from the Shivan Corridor and Valaris Prime. He'd been there since his empire surrendered, waiting for a trial that was still being organized. Most days, he just watched the recordings. He knew the Shivan Corridor battle by heart. Every fighter launch, every drone swarm, every single microsecond of his fleet's annihilation. He would replay the moment the Prometheus decloaked again and again, poring over the sensor data, the energy spikes, the impossible, terrifying speed of the human attack. He wasn't watching for revenge. That fire had gone out weeks ago, leaving behind something colder, harder. He was watching because he had to understand. He had to know how a species the galaxy had written off as a joke had secretly built the most powerful weapon in history. But the part that really shattered his mind was that they had then chosen to just put it away. The Villari would never have done that. No species he'd ever known would have. Power was meant to be used. That was the first and only rule of the galaxy. It was the law that had built every empire and started every war since the dawn of time. The humans had looked at that law, at ultimate power, and decided to just go home. It was, Kion realized, the single most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. Not the ship, not its weapons. The decision. The choice to walk away. Because a species that could build a Prometheus and then choose not to use it was a species he could never predict, never control. A species that couldn't be bought or threatened or reasoned with using any of the rules he understood. A species that was, in the only way that mattered, truly free. A guard stopped at his cell, a Kavari soldier whose clicking walk and big compound eyes were a familiar sight. "You're watching those recordings again," the guard noted. Kion didn't look up from the screen, where the massive hull of the Prometheus was emerging from empty space, blocking out the stars. "Yeah," he said. "Why?" The former legate was quiet for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice was not the arrogant bark that had once mocked humans as insects. It was the quiet, broken voice of a man rebuilding his entire reality from the ground up. "Because I need to remember what it looks like," he said softly, "when the insects refuse the boot." The guard stared for a second, then clicked his mandibles and walked on. The footsteps faded, leaving Kion alone with the ghost on his screen. He hit replay. And somewhere, out in the vast, empty darkness where no one could ever find it, the UES Prometheus drifted on, perfectly silent. Its crew kept watch. Its systems hummed with a quiet, patient power. Its hull, scarred from the battles that remade the galaxy, reflected no light and cast no shadow. It was there. It was always there. Watching, waiting, and hoping, with a deep, profound, and very human hope that it would never be needed again. But ready, just in case. The stars turned, the galaxy lived on, and in the space between, a ghost stood guard over a universe that was finally learning to stand on its own. And that was enough. For now, it was more than enough.